Hi, this is Chuck Gardner, and this is part 2 of my discussion about my experience with the atom zone system and the Kodak system for black and white photography. I think it's important even for digital photographers to understand this background, to better understand the digital technology and how good we have it nowadays. I wanted to start with a couple of personal anecdotes about Ansel Adams. I was aware of him as a teenager, but I really didn't focus on him until 1971 when I was shopping for camera equipment at a Chicago bookstore or a Chicago camera shop, and I found his basic photo series and bought that because I knew that he was famous. I didn't exactly understand the system at that point. Well, when I started out my career, I started out assisting a photographer on Capitol Hill named Vince Finnegan in the summer of 1972. And he was an old school guy that had started with 4x5 speed graphics back in the 40s. He's a member of the White House Press Corps, the official photographer of the Kennedy Center. And I had just impressed him by the fact that I had learned everything on my own. I was smart enough to use professional equipment to get professional results. So he let me carry his bags around Capitol Hill. We'd go up on Capitol Hill every day to the Capitol office buildings, the House Speaker, the Senate chairman, all the different congressmen's office, and we would do these grip and grin pictures of lobbyists handing over, facsimile checks for their trade association newsletter, shaking hands with all these politicians whose pictures I'd seen on TV. So it was a real opener to how Washington works. So I'm working out of his townhouse on 8th and Maryland Avenue in the shadow of the Capitol building one day, and there's a ring at the doorbell. So I go, he's working back in the dark room, so I go and answer the door. I look through the peephole, and I see this sweaty black dude, which looks like your typical bike messenger in Washington in those days. I open the door, and I get a Saturday Night Special .38 revolver wrapped with electrical tape on the butt, pointing in my face. And I know enough about guns to see that there's bullets in the chamber of the revolver. So, okay, well, he has me come in, lays down. Vince comes out, wondering what the hell's going on. He gets ordered on the floor. The guy takes our wallets and our watches. Fortunately, I had like $2 in my wallet and cheap pocket watch. But Vince was one of those guys that had his whole life in his wallet about this thick, so he was a bit upset about that. And on the way out the door, the guy grabs a flight bag. Vince had kept a Hasselblad 1000F camera, which was unique because it had a focal plane shutter. For Hasselblad was rare, and it had a 3,000 or a 300 millimeter lens on it. He was the official photographer for Allegheny Airlines, and he used that to take shots of airplanes taken off at the airport. Well, he was a little bit upset about that, so my future with him wasn't that great. Plus, the afternoon newspaper, the Washington Star, had decided to cease publication that summer, putting 12 very good, talented photojournalists, including one who had won a Pulitzer Prize, out on the street looking for jobs. So my prospects of becoming a photojournalist in Washington went down the toilet. But fortunately, I opened the Sunday paper, look in the want ads for photography jobs, and here's Monte Zucker, who I recognize from Professional Photographer magazine that I became a student member of in college. He's looking for an apprentice. So I call him up, the number in the ad, arrange an appointment. I have to take 3 buses from Arlington, Virginia, transfer 3 buses, then walk a mile to get to his house. He answers the door, and he sits down and he critiques my entire portfolio. And the way he critiqued my portfolio is he took a pair of L-shaped cropping guides and he took the photograph and he said, okay, well, where's your focal point? And he cropped in tight on that focal point, like the eyes and mouth in a portrait. And then he slowly expanded the frame and asked me to say stop when something distracted me. I was so blown away by that, I went home and took this portfolio of 20 zone system prints that I spent my last year in college photographing and matting. It was 11 by 14 prints on 16 by 20, 18% Munsell gray mats per the Gospel of St. Ansel. And I took a mat knife to them and I cut them all down. And I ended up with a collection of 8 by 10s, 5 by 7s, and in one case, it's a photograph of a couple, college friends of mine. And he had pointed out that it was a great portrait of them individually, but they were disconnected. They were too far. It created a ping pong for the eyes. The guy was a Zen master. That's why I did this thing. It was sort of a last-ditch effort because at that point, I had pretty much given up on a photography career. It was either be his apprentice or, go find a job somewhere else. So I called him up. He invites me back, 3 more bus rides and another walk to his house. And he was impressed enough with what I had done, my initiative, to give me the job. And so I started out carrying his bags and moving his off-camera light stand around to learn his techniques. And then he had an apprentice assistant named Gary Bernstein, Penn State graduate in architecture, very smart guy. He had been working for Monte for 2 years, and after Monte hired me, he decided, well, okay, I'm going to take off on my own, and he went off to New York to become a fashion glamour photographer, and ended up being quite famous. He's still a Hollywood photographer, and quite famous as a glamour photographer in his own right. So I got immediately promoted to second shooter, because Monte had double booked weddings on Saturdays. And what he would do is he would shuttle between the 2 weddings because people paid high dollars for a Monte wedding. And his wife, Sandy, who worked with him at the time, was his business partner. She would work with one wedding with me, and Monte would work the other with another assistant he hired, who was he was a photographer who ran the camera shop in downtown Washington, D.C. as a day job. But he would shuttle back and forth just to do a guest appearance because he would do the portraits ahead of time by window light. But to make a long story short, it was an amazing career working for Monte Zucker, but it was impossible to have a career in his shadow. I would be his assistant the rest of my life. And I had discovered that I didn't like sales, the aspect of sales, and I was good at it because I was learning from a master. He could sell sand to the Arabs, but I just didn't enjoy it. I just didn't enjoy the interaction with people, and that's because I'm by nature, a very introverted, intuitive, thinking, perceptive type. So I just wasn't temperamentally set out for retail photography, and I realized I wouldn't be successful at it. So when I had the opportunity to work at National Geographic, I jumped at it. We bought a house next door. My wife and I bought a house next door to a guy that ended up being the assistant chief of the photo labs. Now fast forward. I'm in the Foreign Service as production manager at the printing plant in Manila. And one day we get the DHL shipment from Washington, and the people who unpacked the stuff and brought it down, they come down and they dump a dozen of Ansel Adams' original prints on my office desk. Wow. These weren't gallery quality prints that were marked for reproduction, but these were all original prints by Ansel Adams that he would send out for people who were doing reproductions. Well, when I worked at National Geographic, I had become a halftone expert to the point where I had invented my own exposure computer, and I went to Kodak and DuPont and tried to market it, and they acknowledged that it was, pretty good stuff. I got some nice letters in my file acknowledging that it was good stuff, but they just didn't buy ideas from outside. But I used that same technique as production manager to personally reproduce these Ansel Adams photographs for a magazine called Topic that we sent in French and English to Africa. And they did an article, I think it was this photo that was on the cover that I reproduced, and then the inside was web offset. But you can see here, this is the Stauffer control wedge that is used for exposure control. And what I did that was unusual with these is I used a special double black. This was actually two separate impressions of black, one for the highlight detail and the other for the shadow detail, which is exactly how in digital you have to do high definition photography. And I'm going to do a video on that, the technique I use. But that's one of the personal stories I have of Ansel Adams. The other one involves the story behind the 18% gray card, which was told to me by technicians, technical guys. I had talked to the R&D people at Rochester Kodak when I was trying to sell my halftone computer idea. So I asked them about the 18% gray card, and they told me that when the film standard changed from ASA to ISO, one of the things that changed was the calibration point. Up until the ISO system, the calibration point was for meters was always based on 18% gray, because that was thought to be in the middle of the visual spectrum between black and white. If you took a total grayscale, and I've got several here that I've acquired over the years, that this 18% gray would be in the middle. So if you photograph this, I will photograph this with a camera, and you see the histogram, you would expect the spike to be right in the middle with 18% gray. Well, what happened is by the 1974, when they established this ISO standard, they realized that sensitometrically, in terms of exposing film, it's color film and transparency film, that 12.5 to 13% was the better point for meter adjustments in terms of getting the shadows right and the highlights right. So 12% reflects 5% less light, so it's a darker shade of gray. So if you go online and look for gray cards, you would find 18% cards and 12% cards. Well, the 12% cards would actually give you a more accurate exposure with digital than the 18%. In fact, when you bought an 18% gray card, I bought this set in, I think in 2004 when I had set up my studio lights. The original Kodak gray cards were not RGB balanced. They have a white side and a gray side. This originated as a tool for graphic arts exposure back around the 1920s. It was used in lithography. And this side here reflects 5 times more light than this side, and that was used as a baseline, the same way that this step wedge was used. Well, according to these Kodak guys, when Ansel Adams found out that the speed point was being changed and Kodak was considering changing their 18% gray card to 12% or 13%, whatever the ISO standard was, he threw a hissy fit. He went to Rochester and camped out in Rochester and lobbied the executives at Kodak to badger them into keeping their gray cards 18%. So what happens when I buy my gray card in 2004, I read the instructions, And it says, oh, by the way, if you use this for digital, you have to adjust your exposure by a third stop, because if you just use this and center your histogram in the middle on this gray card, you're going to blow the highlights. So the codec has continued to make the 18%, and I understood from someone in a forum or on YouTube in a post about gray cards, is that eventually ISO changed the standard to back to 18%, because there was so much confusion over the new standard. So those are my two Ansel Adams anecdotes about gray cards and such. Now, all you really need to do is get an optimally exposed negative or a print or digital image, is you need to match the tonal range of the sensor with the lighting range. Now, with artificial lights, like this flash here, if you use two flashes, it's a trivial exercise. How I start with flash is with the fill, which is not how anybody does it now, because they don't have the experience that I do, dating back to 1969-70 when I read my first Kodak lighting book, which said start with centered fill. And there's a valid reason. I'm going to cover that in a future video. But you fill for the shadows on the black towel, wherever that is here, my trusty black and white towels. You just adjust your fill light until you see detail here in the playback, and then you turn on your key light and adjust it until you get the zone 8 detail and zone 2 detail, the definitions that Adams gave us, and you wind up with perfect tonal range in your prints. Now the problem is, outside on a sunny day, the contrast of the light exceeds the tonal range. That's the same problem whenever you use a single off-camera flash or LED source. Anytime you have one source of light, the contrast is going to be too great when you expose the highlights correctly to get shadow detail. It's just a fact of life. Exposing this, shooting this indoors under this light, the lighting is such that I'm going to get some noise in the shadows. It's hard to avoid at ASA 800 that you film C-Log video at. It's just a fact of life, which is why you have noise reduction and tools like that. But that's the biggest thing people don't understand about exposure, is that it's always a compromise if the range of the light exceeds the sensor. There's nothing physically you can do. That's the physical limitation. Back in the days of black and white photography, the limitation was the range of the print. There was more room on the negative, that when you open up curves and you see the straight line, that's the D log E curve response, straight line response of a negative. And with black and white and color negative film, you could overexpose by as much as 2 stops before you start to affect the tonality. What happens with the tonal curve is, if this is the shadows and this is the highlight, there's a shoulder at which point more exposure causes less density on the negative. That's actually how reversal film is made. The slide film you get is negative film that is pre-exposed in the factory to the point the density reverses and goes downhill with more exposure. That's how it's made. People don't know that. I do, because I worked at National Geographic as a photo technician where they shot Kodachrome. So how do you solve the dilemma of too much contrast in lighting? Well, in black and white, Adams devised a system where you measure the shadows and the highlights, and then you adjust the development. When you just adjust the development on a black and white negative, the shadows develop, which has very little density on the negative, develop right away, and they don't develop anymore. They will develop and that's it. But as you leave the film in the developer longer and longer, your highlight values will get more and more density, and that's how you control tonal range on a sunny day. You just leave the negative in the soup longer. And Adams, back in the day when he started out, all the photographers used film that was orthochromatic. Orthochromatic means it's not sensitive to red light. And that allowed them to shoot the negative, and then in the tray of the darkroom under red safe lights, they could develop by eye, and when they saw the highlight density on the negative was right, they just pulled it out of the soup, put it in the stop bath. They did it by eye. It was a craft. It was craftsmanship. And the funny story was, when I was looking for a job in Washington, D.C., I literally knocked on every photography business in the Washington yellow pages and white pages to look for a job. And one of them was Harrison Ewing Studios. Harrison Ewing Studios was a block north of the White House. And they had done the official photographs of the photographers, or of the presidents. And the smallest camera they had in their studio was a 5x7 camera. So the manager of Harrison Ewing, I forget his name, but he was just this flaming queer guy, right? So he hands me a Rolleiflex, two twin lens Rolleiflex, like my dad had a cheaper version of that, so I was familiar with it, and a roll of film, and he tells me, go out, shoot some pictures, and come back to the darkroom and make some prints. So I go out there and I shoot some street scenes. I went over to the Smithsonian museums and shot some stuff over there. And I come back, and then he takes me down to the darkroom. And here's these old guys, right, that'd been working there forever. And I ask him, okay, where's the tanks to develop my film? The roll film. They just laugh at me because, like I said, the smallest camera in the studio was a 5x7 sheet film camera. They didn't have any tanks because they didn't develop roll film. And what they did is they had 3 sinks. One sink full of developer, one sink full of stop bath, and another sink full of water to rinse off the things. So I'm over there developing the roll of film by hand like this in total darkness. And the thing about panchromatic film is you could use a safe light. Briefly, it was a greenish safe light. You used it briefly. So I'm doing this all blind, and then I go to dry off the film, the enlarger, make friends. It was a disaster because I had no idea, no control over anything. But I knew that it was all a joke at my expense, but I went along with it because it was a great experience and great story to tell. But that's the effort I went to find a job in those days. You go out and you just knock on doors, you cold call and say, hey, I'm looking for a job, or at least, an opinion on my portfolio. Could you take a look and tell me what you think? Well, I did that with 20 different photographers in Washington, D.C. before I found one that would give me the time of day, Vince Finnegan, who let me apprentice with him. And I probably would have stayed with him, except that 12 other guys who were more experienced ended up looking for jobs, and one of them ended up working for him. But I was fortunate to work for Monte, who did the same thing Ansel Adams did with development, with lighting. And that's something I'm going to talk about next, because I learned a lot, and I realized, because I was intuitive, that the two of them were just as systematic in different mediums. But the takeaway here is that exposure is a dilemma. Whenever you expose to the right, if you expose to the here, do this, right? If you expose to the right and get your highlights right on the histogram in a digital image, then you look and see where the histogram is falling on the other side. I have a photograph that I took doing some testing back in the early 20s when I got my 20D that will show you that if you take a black and white grayscale or black and white tiles in flat sunlight, you can pretty much reproduce the whole tone range. It's when the lighting comes from an angle and cross lights and creates shadows, that's when your range exceeds the range of the camera. So what are you going to do? Well, you can compromise and you can fudge the exposure and overexpose the shadows to get overexpose the highlights to get the shadow details. But the thing that I learned about perception of 3D shape in photographs is that the flatter the object is, the more specular highlights are important. Specular highlights are the reflection you get from light sources. You don't see this in camera here, but over here I have a silver reflector to bounce some more light onto my face. And in flash, when you take a flash picture, you get catch lights in the eyes. Well, the biggest mistake photographers make outdoors when they take portraits is, and the reason that I'm sitting in here in a light gray room that bounces light everywhere, is that humans evolved with eyebrows that shade the eyes. Whenever you take a picture of a person outdoors, their eyes are going to be shaded. The biggest mistake people make when they do outdoor photography with flash is they don't get the chin of the subject up into the light. Now, I learned that on day one with Monte because he did all of his portraits by daylight. The first lesson he taught me was turn the face 45 degrees to the window to get a short lighting pattern, which is a mask of highlights on the face. And then what you do is you need to raise the face up into the light until you see catch lights in the eyes, because it's the catch lights that give the eyes life. If you photograph food and you have a flat white dinner plate, the only way you're going to see detail in that dinner plate is if you have specular highlights. The same is true of a white car. You don't see any 3D shape in a white car if you don't preserve the contrast between a zone 10 highlight and a zone 9, 98% reflective white. Now here's another funny story, embarrassing for Ansel Adams. In his zone system prior to around 1970, he only put 10 zones in the system. 0 for black to 9 for a solid white. Now, the problem with that is that specular highlights are above zone 9. So what you need to do with a specular, it's not in this book, it's in the negative, but what you need to do in a digital photograph is the specular highlights are your 255 clipping. That's the point where the sensor clips and can absorb no more photons. Now, the only thing you want to be 255 in your photograph are specular highlights, which are things like reflections from chrome or images of flash or catch lights and eyes. And catch lights are just as important on dark objects as white objects. When I photograph dogs, which I do quite frequently because people walk the dogs down the street, and my wife, she does wonderful watercolor pictures of dogs now. But every time I take a picture of a dog, I always have a flash on my camera, because hares, if you look at them under a microscope, have facets in them like mirrors. The same is true of feathers. So if you photograph birds or you photograph dogs, you always want to have a flash on your camera or put the dog in direct sunlight so the fur sparkles. There's a million mirror-like reflections, and just adding flash will do that. When you have a flash, let's see, get one here. Okay, here's a flash, right? The flash has this little pop-up white card on it. That card isn't a diffuser. This thing here, this monster thing I made out of a placemat, is a diffuser. What this does is create enough of a reflection that you get a catch light in the eyes when you bounce the light. That's why I use this big honking diffuser on the flash. I created this starting around 2004 when I started messing around with studio light and speed lights, and you can get lighting on faces that looks just as soft, a word that I hate, as studio lights. I have a photo in my website I'll put in this video that I can show you to compare, where I took the same photograph, or not the same photograph, but I had relatives that visited, and I started out with my speed lights taking portraits, and then I said, oh, let me set up the studio lights, and then I took shots with studio lights, and I was amazed myself when I compared the results. So it's possible with very simple flash equipment, which I'm going to explain in the subsequent video, to get perfectly good lighting. It's really simple. All you have to do is understand the limitations and what you need to do to work around them. If you're taking photographs outdoors of landscapes where you have a static subject, carry a tripod. The best, heaviest tripod you can afford and want to carry. This is one that I bought to do landscapes with. It's got a ball head. I use it for my videos. This bracket here held my iPad that I shot videos with for years, because Canon didn't make a camera that could shoot decent videos for 20 years. That's one of my pet peeves. Can't you tell? So it's really simple. Exposure is simple. All you need to do is first expose for the right. That gets the highlights right. What you want to do is, if you can with a static subject, what you want to do, I'm going to move this over here. What you want to do is get this white towel 1/3 of a stop underexposed in your first test shot. That is, the way I do it is I just increase my exposure until I see clipping in the towel, and then I back it off till the clipping disappears. Now, if you're shooting JPEGs, you don't want any part of the towel to clip, because the playback is a JPEG. But if you're shooting raw, you generally get about a third or half a step more latitude, but still, it's better to get, so nothing except the brightest parts here, or the reflective chrome parts of a stand, clip, because then you have more headroom. Now, what will happen in direct crosslight is you won't have any detail on the black towel. But it's really simple if you use a tripod. You just slow the shutter speed by 3 stops, and bingo, you get an image that has detail in the black shadows. Then what you do in Photoshop or whatever editing, I use Affinity Photo nowadays because it's a better deal, But what you do is you open up the highlight exposure, open up the file with the shadows in it, select all in the shadows, and just paste it on top of the highlight. Then you add a mask and just open the mask where you want shadow detail. It's really that simple. I do it by hand because when you use artificial intelligence to do HDR, it does everything and you get a sea of sameness. But you know, that's my approach to exposure over the years, was that I did it Kodak's way by changing the paper grades to get a full range print. And then I tried Ansel Adams' way, and then I used the hybrid range. And now digitally, you're back to where you have the same limitation in sunny 16 conditions in crosslight. If shooting sports, for instance, if I'm shooting sports and I have black and white uniforms, I stand on the side of the field where the sun is at my back, so all of the players are in backlight, because I know from testing that flat light will give you a better chance of recording everything correctly with minimal light, shadow detail. I also always keep a flash with a bracket connected with a TTL cord on my camera when I'm shooting outdoors. If I'm taking a picture of someone on the sidelines on the football field, I don't shoot sports much, but if I were, what I would do is change the lighting strategy and put the sun behind the subject as backlight. Now, if you were to take an ambient-only exposure of a subject who is backlit, the face would be 3 stops underexposed because the sky and sunlight, you know, they're too far apart. So you add flash, and the reason why you put the flash up high, you know, my eye is here, the flash is up here, is so this comes from the same natural direction, but low enough to get past the brows. This was the solution that Monte Zucker developed for wedding photography with an off-camera flash. This was his fill light. And the off-camera flash was his key light. And we controlled it by distance by shooting. If you were shooting from 11 feet with this, you put your off-camera light with an identical flash at 8 feet. If you moved to 8 feet, you moved the other flash into 5/6 and closed the aperture 1 stop, and you had the same lighting ratio and exposure. That approach revolutionized wedding photography at the time when photographers shifted from shooting black and white to color, and that's what made Monte such a popular teacher and award-winning photographer. So I'm going to leave it at that. As usual, I'm long-winded, but hopefully you find these stories interesting, and I enjoy telling them, so I'm going to keep doing it. So thanks for watching. Leave feedback if you like it. If you don't, leave feedback too and tell me why you don't like it, and I'll try to change. So thanks for watching.